Hi, and welcome to section 4.3 for Econ 2 on the AQA exam board. What will we see today? Today we'll be looking at supply-side policies and what effects they have on the economy. But what are supply-side policies? Supply-side policies are government attempts to increase the productive potential of an economy, which would increase the underlying rate of economic growth. Supply-side policies are mainly microeconomic policies that try to make markets more efficient and increase incentives for economic agents. A successful supply-side policy will shift the LRAS curve outwards as the economy can now produce more goods and services. Supply-side policies are key to sustained non-inflationary economic growth. Supply-side policies can facilitate increases in aggregate demand and reduce inflationary pressure. Let's have a look at supply-side policies on a diagram. So here we have a classical ADAS diagram with price level plotted on the y-axis and real output plotted on the x-axis. Initially, our economy has the long-run aggregate supply curve of LRAS1 and aggregate demand of AD1. This leads to an equilibrium where the price level is PL1 and output is Y1. Successful supply-side policies shift the long-run aggregate supply curve outwards from LRAS1 to LRAS2, and this can allow an increase in aggregate demand and no change in price level. If we suppose that aggregate demand increased to AD2, this would lead to more output, Y2 rather than Y1, and the price level will be the same. This will be the same for the Keynesian view of an aggregate demand aggregate supply diagram. Initially, our economy has a long-run aggregate supply curve of LRS1 and a level of aggregate demand in the economy of AD1. This leads to an equilibrium where the price level is PL1 and real output is Y1. Then there is a successful supply-side policy which shifts the LRAS curve outwards. The outward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve means that the economy can facilitate an increase in aggregate demand whilst maintaining the same price level in the economy. For example, suppose that aggregate demand was to shift out from AD1 to AD2, the economy will be at a new long-run equilibrium where there is more real output, Y2 rather than Y1, and the price level is the same as before, PL1. So we can see that in both the classical and Keynesian case, a successful supply-side policy can facilitate an increase in aggregate demand and reduce inflationary pressures on an economy. However, supply-side policies will not always be an appropriate policy. Suppose that we had a negative output gap in the economy, a supply-side policy would not be appropriate here. Here we have an economy from the classical viewpoint. We have a negative output gap in this economy because the economy is producing a level of output of Y1, which is much lower than the productive potential of the economy, which is where the LRS curve intercepts the real output line. Now assume that the government then adopts some supply-side policies which increases the productive potential of the economy, which is represented graphically by the LRS curve shifting outwards. In the short run, the economy will be in an equilibrium where aggregate demand crosses the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is in the same place as it was before, with a price level of PL1 and an output level of Y1. The supply-side policy here has not decreased the negative output gap and has actually increased the negative output gap because the economy's productive potential has increased. The same picture is showed on the Keynesian diagram. Here our economy is at an equilibrium with the price level at PL1 and real output at Y1. The supply-side policy shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve outwards because the economy's productive potential has increased. This leads to the economy being in pretty much the same equilibrium. You could say that the price level has slightly fallen and real output has slightly increased, but the negative output gap is still significant and the supply-side policy has had a minimal effect. Therefore, if there is a negative output gap in the economy, supply-side policies would not be appropriate. So let's look at some supply-side policies. Supply-side policies are changes in laws, taxation rate, and government expenditure. One example would be a change in tax laws that encourage investment and R&D. The UK government gives firms that engage in R&D tax breaks, which increase the incentive to engage in R&D. If firms engage in R&D, it is likely that they will improve their production processes and become more efficient, which allows them to produce more goods and services, which increases the productive potential of the economy, which causes the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift outwards. Another supply-side policy is education, training and retraining. The government spends large sums of money on education, both higher education and education that is pre-18. Education, training and retraining increases the productivity of the workforce, which causes the productive potential of the economy to increase. Another supply-side policy is the change benefits that encourage individuals to work longer or enter work. A final example of a supply-side policy is deregulation, which is removing regulation from certain industries. Now let's look at how supply-side policies affect the four main aims. The first one is inflation. Inflation will be lower with successful supply-side policies because aggregate supply shifts to the right. Supply-side policies can also help reduce cost-push inflation. Unemployment may also be lower because one supply-side policy could be training, retraining, and increase in education. This can help reduce structural and frictional unemployment. Economic growth will be sustainable with supply-side policies, but there needs to be an increase in aggregate demand as well. We saw earlier that if there was a negative output gap, a supply-side policy would not be appropriate, as it wouldn't change the equilibrium where the economy was at, and there would still be a negative output gap in the economy. Supply-side policies can cause the balance of payments to increase, which will be a decrease in the deficit, or the movement from a deficit to a surplus, or an increase in the balance of payments surplus. This is because supply-side policies allow firms to become more efficient, which means they can produce goods and services at a cheaper price, which makes them more competitive. This means that exports increase because you are more competitive, and imports will fall because domestic consumers will choose to consume domestic goods and services rather than consuming foreign goods and services, as domestic goods and services are now cheaper. With supply-side policies, it's important to distinguish them between supply-side conditions. A supply-side condition is a change in the market affecting supply. For example, a change in a commodity price changes the short-run aggregate supply curve. This change in the commodity price does not have any effect on how much the economy can produce, which means the LRAS curve stays where it is because the productive potential of the economy has not changed. Whereas a technological advancement that improves productivity will increase the amount an economy can produce, and this is a supply-side improvement. This supply-side improvement may have occurred because of government policy to encourage firms to engage in research and development.